You were never meant to know what happened inside the royal chambers of Madrid on that winter night in 1834. The court archivists buried the truth under layers of official lies, the Vatican locked the most damning accounts behind sealed doors, and the few witnesses who dared speak of it, vanished. But here's what they could never erase. The king is dead. Ferdinand VII, the monarch who ruled Spain with paranoia and cruelty, lies cold and pale beneath silk sheets embroidered with the Bourbon crest. Yet this is not a moment of solemn dignity. You are not in a funeral hall, you are in a locked chamber that smells of candle wax and fear. The Queen Regent stands before you, her voice trembling but her eyes sharp. She gives an order so disturbing, so unprecedented, you feel the weight of it in your bones. Preserve the king, all of him. The body is uncovered. You see what the history books never dared to print. Not his face, but the grotesque symbol of his reign. An anatomical aberration so bizarre it seems like a cruel joke from the gods. Massive, misshapen, almost alien in its proportions. You can't stop staring, because in this moment you realize, this single piece of flesh is not just a biological oddity. It is the perfect metaphor for Ferdinand's rule, unnatural, overgrown, and destructive to everything it touched. The whispers in the palace corridors rush back to you, the cushions, the screaming brides, the failed heirs. You remember the secret writings of court physicians, describing dimensions and deformities in cold medical terms, as if trying to tame the horror by making it clinical. You recall the stories of a man who hid his shame with cruelty, who saw mockery in every glance, who punished anyone that got too close to the truth. And here is the truth they hid from the world: Ferdinand's corruption did not begin on the throne. It began the moment he was born, a cursed product of centuries of royal inbreeding. His mind twisted by humiliation. His heart hardened by ridicule. His throne was not built on loyalty or love, but on a desperate, vicious need to assert control over a world that saw him as a freak. And what you are about to learn will pull you into a history so rotten, so diseased at its roots, that once you see it, you can never unsee it. Ferdinand's story does not begin with glory, it begins with rot. His birth was not a celebration of life, but a continuation of decay. The Spanish Bourbons, desperate to keep bloodlines pure, had twisted nature into a noose. Cousin married cousin. Uncle married niece. The same faces, the same features, the same flaws, recycled for centuries. Each generation carried forward the hidden weaknesses, and in Ferdinand, those weaknesses bloomed into something monstrous. He was born in the El Escorial Palace in 1784, the air thick with incense and arrogance. The court saw him as an heir, but nature saw him as a warning. From his earliest days, physicians whispered. Something about the boy was wrong. The shape of his body. The oddness of his proportions. The way he avoided the eyes of strangers. The truth, too dangerous to admit, was that the future king carried the visible scars of centuries of genetic corruption. In those years, Spain itself was a kingdom fraying at the edges, bled by corruption, manipulated by foreign powers, and suffocating under the weight of its own traditions. Ferdinand absorbed this poison like a child absorbs milk. He watched his father, Charles IV, stumble through rule, too weak to command respect. He watched his mother, Queen Maria Luisa, flaunt her affair with the power-hungry Manuel de Godoy, teaching her son, not with words, but with daily humiliation, that power belonged to those willing to take it without shame. Ferdinand's deformity became the secret heartbeat of his paranoia. Servants whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. Diplomats sent coded letters to their home countries, describing the peculiar royal condition, in veiled terms. Every laugh in the hallway became an insult. Every polite bow felt like mockery. He learned early that trust was a weakness, and he would never allow weakness in himself again. By adolescence, Ferdinand's cruelty was not yet the cruelty of a ruler, but the cruelty of a cornered animal. A page who accidentally caught sight of him half-dressed was not merely dismissed, his family was exiled from Madrid. A stable boy who made an offhand joke about royal proportions was found beaten so badly he could no longer walk. Ferdinand had discovered something intoxicating: fear could erase humiliation. But humiliation always returns. And for Ferdinand, it returned in the form of marriage, an event meant to secure the dynasty, and one that would expose the depth of his private nightmare to another soul for the first time. The marriage was meant to be a spectacle, a union between Ferdinand and his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The cathedral blazed with candles. Choirs filled the air with music that spoke of hope and divine blessing. Outside, the streets of Madrid overflowed with cheering crowds, unaware that what they celebrated was not a romance, but the sealing of two ancient bloodlines already rotting from the inside. Maria Antonia was young, beautiful, and hopelessly naive. Raised on stories of noble knights and chivalrous kings, she believed the rumors that called Ferdinand the desired one. She thought she was stepping into the life of a fairy tale queen. But fairy tales end at the wedding feast. Reality begins on the wedding night. When the moment came, Ferdinand's valet discreetly approached the ladies-in-waiting with special requests for the bridal chamber. They were told these preparations were traditional, though none of them had ever heard of such things. Cushions of a strange, curved shape. Bottles of oils and thick salves. Implements that looked less like tools of love and more like instruments of surgery. The women exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed, for in the palace, obedience was survival. Maria Antonia had been given a vague education about marriage by nervous older women, but no one could have prepared her for what she saw when Ferdinand disrobed. A lady-in-waiting, years later in a secret letter, would describe the scene. Her Majesty screamed as though she had seen the devil himself. She cried "monster" again and again, pressing herself against the wall, her hands trembling. The deformity was not just in its size, but in its grotesque shape, the bizarre curvature, the strange growths, the alien texture of it. It was a weapon, not a lover's flesh. Ferdinand, already hardened by years of shame, did not comfort her. He summoned his physicians. The custom cushions were arranged. The oils were applied. And then began an act that was less a consummation than a cold, clinical operation. Even with the aids, the attempt left Maria Antonia in tears, her body aching, her mind fractured. Laudanum was brought to calm her. This was to become their ritual: preparation, sedation, and a mechanical, joyless attempt at producing an heir. No love. No tenderness. Only duty, pain, and the unspoken knowledge that each encounter was another small death for them both. Ferdinand's paranoia deepened. In her revulsion, he saw betrayal. In her tears, he saw mockery. And in her inability to bear him a child, he saw treason. Failure breeds desperation, and desperation, in a man like Ferdinand, becomes something far more dangerous. Each failed attempt at conception did not humble him, it inflamed him. He convinced himself that Maria Antonia's revulsion was an act of defiance, that her body's rejection of him was a deliberate insult. And if nature would not bend to him willingly, he would force it to bend. The palace workshops, which once produced saddles and ceremonial armor, began crafting other, more private items. Straps of leather lined with silk. Restraints that could pin Maria Antonia's limbs without leaving marks. Pillows shaped to force her hips into alignment. Every detail was designed for one purpose: to remove her choice entirely from the act of producing an heir. In the royal court, these objects were never spoken of, but the artisans knew what they were making. They also knew better than to ask questions. But Ferdinand's control did not stop at the physical. He turned to the stars for answers, consulting astrologers and self-proclaimed prophets. He had their charts drawn for every possible date of union, cross-referenced with lunar cycles and omens. When the heavens offered no child, he sought the earth's darker powers. One day, a mystic arrived at the palace, claiming to be from the Far East. He told Ferdinand that his deformity was no curse, it was the mark of the dragon's rod, a sign of divine favor and hidden power. He whispered that only the proper rituals could unlock its full fertility. Ferdinand listened. For 3 months, he subjected himself and Maria Antonia to nights drenched in incense smoke, chanting in unknown tongues, and contortions drawn from supposed ancient scrolls. Twice, Maria Antonia conceived. And twice, she lost the child. The first miscarriage came in the 4th month. The second, barely weeks into pregnancy. In both cases, the palace shrouded the events in secrecy, but behind closed doors the truth was known, the strain of Ferdinand's anatomy, the forced positions, the endless physical trauma. It had destroyed any hope her body had of carrying life to term. Maria Antonia withered, clinging to laudanum as her only escape. Ferdinand, however, did not see a broken woman, he saw an enemy conspiring against his bloodline. And when a paranoid king decides his queen is the obstacle, history turns to blood. By the winter of 1806, Maria Antonia was a shadow of the woman who had arrived in Madrid full of light and naive hope. Her once bright eyes were dulled by the constant haze of laudanum, her body frail from years of trauma. She spoke less, laughed never, and avoided Ferdinand whenever possible. But in the twisted logic of the king, her withdrawal was not the result of cruelty, it was proof of guilt. Rumors began to swirl in the palace corridors. Whispers that the queen confided in foreign diplomats. That she prayed not for a child, but for deliverance from her marriage. That she had even written letters to her family in Naples, begging to be rescued. Whether these whispers were truth or invention mattered little, Ferdinand heard them, and to a man ruled by paranoia, whispers were as deadly as evidence. Ferdinand began keeping her under constant watch. Servants were replaced with his own loyal men. Every letter she wrote was intercepted. Every visitor was questioned. The royal physicians, men already complicit in her suffering, were ordered to monitor her behavior under the guise of caring for her health. And then came the sickness. It began subtly, waves of nausea, a persistent cough, a strange weakness in her limbs. The doctors told her it was an infection of the lungs, but behind their eyes, there was something colder, something practiced. Court gossip later hinted at medicinal treatments prescribed to her by royal order, bitter tonics and powders that seemed to sap her strength instead of restoring it. By May, she could no longer leave her chambers. Her breathing was shallow, her body wasting away. Ferdinand visited her only occasionally, always flanked by attendants, his gaze not of pity but of silent accusation. She was 21 years old when she died, her body so frail she seemed almost childlike again. The official cause of death was tuberculosis. But many in the court believed otherwise. The more daring whispered that Ferdinand had ordered her slowly poisoned, a final punishment for her failure to give him an heir, and for the shame she carried in her eyes every time she looked at him. Maria Antonia was buried with royal honors, her coffin draped in silk, her death mourned in public as a tragedy of fate. But in the shadows of Madrid, among the servants and lesser courtiers, another truth took root, that the queen had been destroyed, piece by piece, by the very man who once vowed to protect her. And Ferdinand? His reign of cruelty had only just begun. With Maria Antonia gone, Ferdinand's cruelty no longer had the boundaries of the bedchamber. It spilled into the throne room, the streets, and the very arteries of Spain's political life. The man who once reserved his rage for whispered insults and private humiliations now wielded it as state policy. And it was here, in the public sphere, that Ferdinand's paranoia became something far more dangerous, a weaponized system of control. The death of his wife gave him a new obsession, rooting out enemies who might threaten his power. In his mind, they were everywhere, in the liberal factions who sought reform, in the clergy who questioned his decisions, even in the royal court that bowed before him each morning. Ferdinand began purging officials without warning. Ministers who had served loyally for decades were sent into exile. Judges who ruled against his wishes found themselves accused of treason. Those who resisted vanished into prisons where no law reached, their names struck from records as if they had never existed. He mastered the art of fear. The streets of Madrid became quieter, not from peace, but from the silence of a population that knew one careless word could be overheard. Ferdinand revived secret police networks, embedding informants in taverns, marketplaces, and even churches. Priests were pressured to report unpatriotic confessions from their congregants, turning the sanctity of the confessional into another instrument of the crown. And behind all of it, there was an unspoken truth: Ferdinand's need for control was not only political. It was personal. Every law he twisted, every freedom he crushed, was a mirror of the same domination he had once exercised over his wife. He ruled Spain the way he ruled a woman, with fear, surveillance, and the certainty that disobedience would be punished without mercy. Foreign diplomats saw through the facade. In coded letters sent to Paris, London, and Vienna, they described a king consumed by delusions of conspiracy and compulsions of the body and mind. But none of them spoke these words aloud in Madrid. They smiled, they bowed, they played the game, because they knew that in Ferdinand's Spain, truth was poison. It was during this period that Ferdinand began collecting not just power, but secrets. Every scandal, every hidden vice of his nobles, every whispered sin of the clergy, he kept them like weapons in a locked arsenal. And when the time came, he would use them, not just to keep power, but to humiliate those who had ever dared to laugh at him. By 1814, Ferdinand had transformed secrecy into currency. His private chambers were not just a king's sanctuary, they were a vault of leverage. Locked drawers held letters stolen from diplomats, intercepted confessions from priests, and personal diaries of nobles obtained through bribed servants. In this empire of shadows, the truth was a weapon that never dulled. He learned that fear of public shame could bend even the proudest neck. A bishop who preached against corruption suddenly changed his sermons after Ferdinand hinted that certain letters, written in the bishop's own hand, might fall into the wrong eyes. A general once loyal to the reformists found himself swearing eternal allegiance to the king after a sealed packet arrived at his home containing sketches of his mistress, captured without his knowledge. The church, once a potential rival to royal power, became another instrument in Ferdinand's hand. He granted priests immunity for their own sins in exchange for information. Confessional booths became listening posts. Sacred vows of secrecy were broken in exchange for royal favor. From the altar to the courthouse, every institution began to speak with Ferdinand's voice, or not at all. To the public, he presented himself as the savior of Spain, the restorer of order after years of chaos. But order, in Ferdinand's lexicon, meant silence. Dissenters were not merely imprisoned, they were erased. Portraits removed from family homes. Names deleted from baptismal records. Gravestones chiseled bare so that even the dead could no longer speak. Here's where I need you to focus, because if you've followed me this far, you're already too deep to turn back. In every age, rulers like Ferdinand have existed, men who rule by fear, secrecy, and the slow strangulation of truth. They are not bound to a century or a crown. They are here, now, in different clothes, smiling with different words. The methods remain the same. So if you understand this, if you see the pattern, I want you to write in the comments, I see through the crown of lies. Write it twice. Once for the man you've been, and once for the man you are becoming. Let the algorithm carry that message into the open, where it can't be buried. Because the deeper we go, the more dangerous this becomes. And the next revelation about Ferdinand VII will make even his political tyranny look almost human. Power did not satisfy Ferdinand, it only sharpened his hunger. Once his political enemies were silenced and the church bent to his will, he turned inward again, to pleasures that no court chronicler dared record. Behind the high stone walls of the royal palace, nights unfolded that made even his most loyal confidants avert their eyes. It began with the same pathology that had shaped his marriage, domination as a form of intimacy. But now, with no queen to restrain him, Ferdinand's indulgences spiraled into grotesque displays of control. The same artisans who had once crafted marital aids for his union with Maria Antonia were summoned again, this time to create elaborate devices of restraint and positioning, but no longer for a single partner. Witnesses later claimed these chambers held furniture that was neither wholly a bed nor wholly a throne, contraptions meant to elevate the king's body above all others, forcing his partners to kneel, bow, or bend in ritualized humiliation. The women brought to him came from many walks of life: noble daughters traded for political favor, courtesans purchased for a season, and, disturbingly, servants plucked from their duties without warning. Once inside his private rooms, there was no rank, no protection. Ferdinand demanded absolute compliance, and the penalties for refusal were severe: exile, public disgrace, or whispered disappearances. Even his allies began to fear him. Not because of the sexual acts themselves — court history is filled with monarchs of twisted appetites — but because Ferdinand blurred the line between pleasure and punishment until they became indistinguishable. A merchant whose son had spoken ill of the crown might find his daughter summoned to the palace under the guise of royal service. A political rival could be forced to stand by while his own kin was paraded through the king's inner chambers like a prize. This was not lust. It was theater of dominance, staged to remind everyone that Ferdinand's power was not limited to the public square. He could touch the untouchable, take the untakeable, and leave behind nothing but silence. And it was in this silence that Ferdinand discovered his most dangerous skill: the ability to make people complicit in their own humiliation. Those who entered his chambers often left with gifts, jewels, land, promises, but also with the unspoken knowledge that their shame could be revealed at any time. That kind of fear does not fade. It festers. It turns entire families into obedient servants of the crown. What came next would push even this carefully crafted system past its limits, because Ferdinand's body, the source of his lifelong paranoia, was beginning to fail him. And a king who fears losing his strength becomes unpredictable. By the early 1820s, Ferdinand's body was betraying him. The same man who once stalked palace corridors with the gait of a predator now walked with a stiffness that made every step seem calculated, defensive. His hands trembled when he signed decrees. His breath grew labored during long audiences. And though the court physicians spoke in vague, reassuring terms, Ferdinand could read the truth in their eyes: the king was aging faster than he should. For a man whose entire life had been shaped by a deep sense of physical inadequacy, this decline was intolerable. Power had given him the illusion of invulnerability; now that illusion was cracking. He became obsessed with remedies: imported tonics from France, herbal concoctions from the colonies, strange electrical devices said to invigorate the royal essence. Palace servants whispered that his bedchamber smelled of bitter tinctures and burnt copper, the residue of untested treatments. But the worst symptom was not physical, it was psychological. Every tremor, every moment of breathlessness, convinced him that his enemies were circling. He became convinced that the court physicians were agents of assassination, slipping poison into his wine or applying healing bombs laced with slow-acting toxins. Meals were tested by servants, sometimes twice. Letters were burned unopened if the wax seal looked imperfect. This paranoia made him more dangerous than ever. Ministers who brought him bad news were accused of sabotage. Guards were rotated daily to prevent loyalty fatigue. Even members of his own family found themselves interrogated about imagined plots. Ferdinand began sleeping in different rooms each night, never telling more than one servant where he would be. The palace itself became a fortress of suspicion. Doors that had once stood open were locked, keys kept on Ferdinand's person at all times. Hallways were patrolled not just by soldiers, but by silent shadows, agents of his secret police, ordered to report even the king's own blood relations if they acted out of pattern. And yet, there was another layer to this fear. Ferdinand knew that the power he had maintained through blackmail and humiliation could not survive if he appeared weak. His entire rule was built on the image of a man who could not be touched, not by law, not by scandal, not by shame. To show vulnerability was to invite rebellion. It was during these final years of mounting paranoia that Ferdinand began preparing his most chilling safeguard, a contingency so ruthless that, Even if he died, his enemies would suffer. Ferdinand's final safeguard was not a fortress, nor an army, nor a treaty. It was a curse, not in the supernatural sense, but in the way only a man like him could craft, a network of destruction that would outlive him. He called it La Cadena Negra, the black chain. It was a simple but vicious idea. Over the decades, Ferdinand had collected mountains of incriminating material, private letters, financial records, illicit sketches, confessions coaxed in drunken moments. These were not stored in one place, but scattered in sealed packets across the empire, in monasteries, embassies, and the vaults of loyal merchants. Each packet was tied to a simple instruction: if Ferdinand died under suspicious circumstances, the contents would be released. He did not leave this to chance. Trusted intermediaries were given keys, passwords, or fragments of maps, never the whole picture. No single person knew where every packet was hidden, but all knew enough to fear them. The effect was suffocating. Even as his body weakened, Ferdinand could look a rival in the eye and see the hesitation, the calculation: if I move against him, will my family's shame be on every street corner? The black chain extended beyond political enemies. Some packets targeted wealthy merchants, others noble houses, others even foreign allies. France, Britain, the Papal States, all had secrets in Ferdinand's grasp. It was a genius of cruelty. His death could hurt them more than his life ever had. But here's the part that chills me, and should chill you. The black chain wasn't just about survival. It was about immortality. Ferdinand understood something that most tyrants never do: fear can be inherited. If he couldn't rule from the grave, he could at least ensure his name was still whispered in the halls of power, not as a memory, but as a present danger. In his final months, he spoke less, smiled rarely, and spent long hours staring at the locked cabinet in his private study, the only place where he knew the location of every packet. That knowledge died with him in 1833. But not all the packets were destroyed. Some were opened. Some are still missing. And in this, Ferdinand achieved his truest ambition: not to be loved, not even to be feared while alive, but to leave a shadow so long that even centuries later, we find ourselves standing in it.